Lecture 8. How much is enough? All his life, Paul TerHorst wanted to be rich. Even in grade school, he looked forward to having a corporate job, joining the world of big business. I didn't just dream about money and power and expense account living, he says. I planned for it. He grew up and made it happen. TerHorst got his MBA from Stanford, then became a certified public accountant and joined a large accounting firm. At age 30, he became partner in the company. He had a huge office, a leather chair, and a view of a polluted river. He had achieved everything he'd always dreamed of. But at age 33, while on a business trip to Europe, he overheard two guys talking about a friend who had retired early. TerHorst was intrigued. He began toying with the notion that if he could figure out a way to live off the money he already had, then maybe he'd never have to work again. It took him 2 years to figure everything out, but in 1984, at age 35, TerHorst made the leap. He retired, and he's been retired ever since. In 1988, he published a book called Cashing In on the American Dream to share his experience, and the experience of others who had made the early exit from the workplace. When he retired, TerHorst had amassed a wealth snowball roughly equivalent to 25 times his annual expenses. Because the FIRE movement has experienced a surge of popularity over the past decade, many folks tend to believe these are new ideas. But they're not. TerHorst was talking about this stuff nearly 40 years ago, and even he wasn't the first. Recently, for instance, I found a book from 1919 called Financial Independence at 50, which explores many of these same topics. Here's another example. In February 1957, Life magazine published a photo essay exploring the world of early retirement. The men and women profiled in the article had quit their careers and moved their families to cheaper locations. Here's an interesting thing about that Life magazine article, though. These early retirees left their careers with only about 2 years' worth of income. That might equate to 4 years of spending, maybe. In the first lesson of this course, I suggested that you need to have 25 times your annual spending to consider yourself financially independent. And that's what TerHorst did before he cashed in on the American dream. Now, where do these numbers come from? How can you know how much to save for retirement? How much is enough? In this lesson, we'll do our best to answer these questions. I like to think of it like we're planning for a road trip, and we want to know how much gas we'll use. To figure this out, we need to know how far we're traveling and how fuel efficient our vehicle is. Similarly, to figure out how much you need to save for retirement, you need to have some idea of how long you're going to live, in other words, how far you're going, and how much you'll spend, which is like your car's gas mileage. Let's start by talking about how long you can expect to live. Life expectancy is a key variable in determining how much money you need to save for retirement and how much you can spend. Unfortunately, it's also a variable that's tough to calculate with any kind of precision. You know that it's highly unlikely that you'll live to the age of 100, right? But it's very likely that you'll live past 50. Between these two extremes, though, it's tough to guess how much time you have left on Earth. Why is life expectancy important? Well, if your assumptions about longevity are too pessimistic, you risk running out of money before you die. If you make decisions based on the belief that you'll die by 65, but then you live until 95, you're going to end up broke for a long, long time. You'll spend decades eating beans and rice. On the other hand, if your assumptions about life expectancy are too optimistic, you risk not getting to use the money you've saved. If you budget as though you're going to live until 95, but you end up dead at 65, you'll have missed the chance to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Here's the bottom line. If we knew when we were going to die, then financial planning would be simple. You could easily calculate how much money you need to get from now to then. Imagine that next week, Elon Musk announces he's developed the Methuselah, a machine that tells users the precise date and time of their deaths. It's 100% accurate and somehow even accounts for accidental death. If you used the Methuselah machine, you'd know whether you need to keep working or if you could call it quits right now. You'd know whether you had enough saved to travel the world in luxury or if you need to maintain a more meager existence. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, there isn't any way to tell with precision how long you have left to live. Elon Musk has not developed the Methuselah machine. Not yet, anyhow. All you can do is make an educated guess. One simple way to estimate your time remaining is to consult what's called an actuarial life table. An actuarial life table uses broad population statistics to estimate your remaining life expectancy based on demographic factors. Let's use the U.S. Social Security Administration's life table as an example. Looking at the stats, a 51-year-old man like me has 0.5% chance to die in the next year. On average, I can expect to live another 28.84 years. Now, actuarial tables are great, but they provide only general information. They make predictions based on large populations. But you are not a large population. You are an individual, and you have individual habits and individual genetic predispositions. For a more customized guess at your date of death, you can use one of the many online life expectancy calculators. To one degree or another, these tools take into account variables like diet, exercise, and family history. When I computed my own life expectancy 3 years ago, these calculators told me that, on average, I could expect to live until age 82. Today, though, they show that my average life expectancy has dropped to about 76. I've stopped exercising and I've gained weight. As a result, I've trimmed 6 years from my expected date of death. I guess it's time to hit the gym. Life expectancy calculators give more personalized results than actuarial tables, but the numbers are still just guesses based on population metrics. When you are planning for your own financial future, make adjustments based on what you know of yourself and your family history. Personally, I find it helpful to plan for two contradictory futures. On the one hand, I make plans based on projections from life expectancy calculators. That means that I need to assume I'll live another 25 or 30 years. On the other hand, I assume I'll be dead within 5 years. The men in my family tend to die young from cancer, so I'm not fooling myself about my chances. Now, planning as if I only have 5 years left does not mean that I'm spending through my savings. I still remember that it's possible for me to live another 28.84 years. But I do make choices, traveling with friends for instance, that I might otherwise defer if I knew for sure I'd live into my 80s. Now's a good time for us to pause. Before we continue, take a few minutes to think about your own life expectancy. Head to the web to experiment with some of the actuarial tables and longevity calculators. Play with the variables. Based on the results, make a guess as to how long you have left in the world. Okay, now that you have some idea how long the journey will be, it's time to estimate what kind of gas mileage your vehicle will get, how much you're likely to spend in retirement. Financial planners traditionally recommend that clients build a wealth snowball that will replace 70% of their income, or 80%, or 90%. The precise ratio varies from planner to planner, but the core idea is the same. Base your retirement savings on some level of replacement income. I think this is silly. Estimating your retirement needs based on income is like trying to guess how much gas you'll need for a road trip based on the size of your vehicle's gas tank. To determine how much gas you'll use, you need to know how far you're going and how much gas your car uses. The size of the gas tank is irrelevant. Likewise, your current income has little bearing on your retirement spending. This is especially true for folks who want to retire early. Let me explain why. Say you're serious about financial freedom. You earn $100,000 per year, but have cut your spending to maybe $30,000. Using traditional advice, you wouldn't be able to retire until your wealth snowball was large enough for you to draw $70,000 or $80,000 or $90,000 a year, far more than you actually need. With traditional advice, you'd end up working much longer than necessary. Now, imagine a friend who earns $50,000 per year but spends $60,000. He spends more than he earns. He's accumulating debt. Again, traditional retirement advice fails him, this time because it leads him to underestimate how much he needs to save. Instead of estimating how much to save for retirement based on your income, it makes far more sense to plan your retirement needs around spending. Your spending reflects your lifestyle, but your income doesn't. So, how much do you need to save for retirement? How much will you spend? It depends. For many people, expenses drop when they stop working. They drive less, the kids are out of the house, the mortgage is gone, and ironically, they no longer have to save for retirement. Meanwhile, other expenses increase. Healthcare costs, for instance, tend to balloon as we age. The 2016 Retirement Confidence Survey found that about 38% of Americans spend more in retirement than they did while working. About 21% spend less, and another 38% spend roughly the same. Based on this and other research, I believe that your pre-retirement expenses are an excellent predictor of your post-retirement expenses, so I use this rule of thumb. When estimating how much you need to save for retirement, assume you'll spend about the same in the future as you do now. Having said that, it's important to modify this general advice based on your own specific situation. If you currently have kids living at home, for instance, and they'll soon go off to college, well, your expenses are probably much higher now than they will be in a decade. Or if you're single and living on rice and beans, but plan to travel when you're through with work, then you should probably plan for your expenses to increase. Use your current expenses as a starting point when planning for retirement, but make educated adjustments based on your personal goals and expectations. Okay, great. In planning your road trip, we now have a rough idea of how many miles you'll drive and how much gas the car will use. Maybe you found that you can expect to live another 30 years, and you'll probably spend around $50,000 annually. How do we actually use this info to figure out how much to save before retiring? You could simply multiply the number of years you have remaining by your expected spending level. In this case, you'd multiply 30 years by $50,000 to get $1.5 million. This number will certainly get you where you need to go. But in most cases, this method ends up overestimating how much you need to save for retirement, which could lead you to working longer than you need. Fortunately, we have a tool that can help us make better plans. That tool is the 4% rule for sustainable withdrawals. Your financial life can be divided into two broad phases. During the accumulation phase of life, you build wealth. While you're young, you work hard and invest wisely. If you're careful and fortunate, you'll amass a wealth snowball. When you're older, you enter the consumption phase, or the wealth preservation phase of life. You're no longer a net saver, you're a net spender. After you retire, your income drops sharply and you begin to live off your savings. Here's a fact that's surprising but true. The very same qualities that foster success during the accumulation phase of life can actually make things difficult during the consumption phase. Frugal folks find themselves in their 60s with ample savings but a reluctance to spend, even when it's in their best interest. But what good is a stockpile of cash if you don't use that money to improve your life? I'm not making this up. This is a real challenge that financial advisors face: how to get certain clients to loosen the purse strings. To help guide clients to ease their minds, financial planners often talk about what are called safe withdrawal rates. For reasons that will become clear, I prefer to use the term sustainable withdrawal rates instead. Your sustainable withdrawal rate is the pace at which you can draw down your investments while retaining a high probability that you won't outlive your money. If I say that I have a 5% withdrawal rate, for instance, I mean that I'm taking 5% out of my retirement savings every year. The trouble, of course, is that there are so many unknowns. There's your life expectancy, as we just discussed, but there are other factors to consider, such as inflation, market returns, and so-called black swan events like the recent coronavirus epidemic or the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Fortunately, research shows that it is possible to calculate sustainable withdrawal rates that provide a high likelihood that your retirement savings will last as long as you do. For simplicity's sake, a lot of people use the 4% rule. This rule, which is actually a loose guideline and not a literal rule, says that generally speaking, you can spend 4% from your investment portfolio each year without dying broke. The 4% rule is the source of my advice in this course that you can consider yourself financially independent once you've saved 25 times your annual spending. I'm simply restating the 4% rule in different words. But where does this 4% rule come from? And how do we know that it's reliable? In the October 1994 issue of the Journal of Financial Planning, William Bengen published an article entitled Determining Withdrawal Rates Using Historical Data. Before Bengen, financial planners used historical averages to make predictions about retirement. Bengen argued that using average market returns and average inflation for computing withdrawal rates was misguided. Instead, he advocated planning based on real-world history. The long-term effects of certain financial catastrophes, Bengen wrote, can overwhelm the averages. These financial catastrophes, or black swan events, have an especially profound impact if they come at the start of your retirement. Bengen showed that a person who retired at an inopportune time, such as immediately before the recession of 1973 and 74, could not adequately maintain her spending using traditional planning assumptions. With history as his guide, Bengen found that an initial withdrawal rate of 3%, adjusted annually for inflation, was, quote, absolutely safe. That is, a retiree who spent 3% of her portfolio's value each year would never have run out of money in the past. Her wealth snowball would always have lasted at least 50 years. For most people, though, a withdrawal rate of 3% feels restrictive. Fortunately, Bengen's calculations showed that a first-year withdrawal rate of 4%, with adjustments for inflation in following years, offered similar results. Based on historical data, a 4% withdrawal rate would have always allowed a client's wealth snowball to survive for 33 years, and usually much longer. Obviously, this isn't as secure as a 3% withdrawal rate, which can be expected to last for 50 years, but it's safe enough for most people. Now, it's important to talk about Bengen's assumptions. His research was predicated on an asset allocation of 50% stocks and 50% bonds. He wrote, "The 50-50 mix appears to be near optimum for generating the highest possible minimum portfolio longevity." Or, in plain English, a 50-50 asset allocation minimizes the risk that you'll outlive your money. It does not, however, maximize the potential growth of your wealth snowball. Bengen showed that a portfolio comprising 75% stocks and 25% bonds tended to both increase overall client wealth and increase the odds of a portfolio lasting longer. The downside was that it also increased the odds of a portfolio running out sooner. Ultimately, his recommendation was to accept a stock allocation as close to 75% as possible, and in no cases lower than 50%. And, except for unusual personal circumstances, there's no real reason to alter this asset allocation during retirement. In the 25 years since Bengen first published his paper, other studies have found similar results. Most notably, 3 professors from Trinity University in San Antonio published an article in February 1998 that has become widely known as the Trinity Study. Writing for the American Association of Individual Investors, they looked at how various withdrawal rates would have affected retirement portfolio longevity based on market history. The Trinity Study examined 200 different combinations of withdrawal rates, asset allocations, and payout periods. The authors reached similar conclusions to Bengen. Using historical data, a retirement portfolio of 75% stocks and 25% bonds almost always survived for 30 years at a 4% withdrawal rate. The Trinity Study offered one subtle but important change to the conversation. Whereas Bengen talked about safe withdrawal rates in his article, the Trinity Study discussed sustainable withdrawal rates. Both pieces explored the very same idea, but they used different terminology. You see, when we talk about safe withdrawal rates, some folks want to argue. No withdrawal rate is 100% safe, they say, and they're right. But this is a distraction from the main point, the big idea. By instead discussing sustainable withdrawal rates, it's possible to continue the conversation without getting distracted by a semantic debate. So, when you hear people talking about safe withdrawal rates, make a mental substitution. Understand that sustainable withdrawal rates is a better term. Anyhow, subsequent studies have tended to support Bengen's work. Generally speaking, based on past history, if you were to withdraw 3% of your investment portfolio during the first year of retirement, then adjust your withdrawals for inflation in subsequent years, your money should last at least 50 years. If you were to withdraw 4% of your investment portfolio during the first year of retirement, then your money should last 30 years. If you were to withdraw 5% of your investment portfolio during your first year of retirement, you'll still have good odds of success. Based on history, your money would have about a 73% chance of lasting 30 years. So what's the bottom line? For estimating purposes, assume that you can sustainably spend 4% of your wealth snowball every year in retirement. 4% is a sustainable withdrawal rate. If you want to be especially safe, use 3% instead. 3% is a safe withdrawal rate. And if you're feeling bold, or if you have a short time horizon, you might consider using 5%. 5% is a gutsy withdrawal rate. Now, let's talk about some limitations of the 4% rule. While this is indeed a very useful guideline and one of the pillars of the entire early retirement philosophy, its use comes with a number of caveats. It's the best tool we have, no doubt, but it is not a perfect tool. I've already hinted at one of the problems. People have a tendency to become dogmatic when you use words like rule or safe. And when people get dogmatic, arguments ensue. So it's important to be clear that the 4% rule is not actually a rule. It's a guideline. And safe withdrawal rates aren't safe in that they're 100% guaranteed, because they're not. So far, though, history has proven them sustainable. Speaking of history, that leads us to a second problem with the 4% rule. Bengen's work, and the work of those who followed him, was based on real-world data from the past century or so. How do we know that the future will look like the past? We don't know, obviously. It's possible, probable even, that seismic shifts in our society will make it impossible to predict our financial futures based on what has come before. For now, though, we don't have anything better to go on. The past is our best roadmap to the future. Here's another problem with the 4% rule. It assumes level spending over time. From my experience, and the experiences of other people I've spoken with, spending in early retirement is not level. It fluctuates from year to year, and sometimes it fluctuates wildly. Last year, for example, I had an unexpected medical issue. My healthcare spending, which is typically only a few $100s per year, exploded to over $8,000. On the other hand, when I took a year-long RV trip across the U.S. in 2015, my spending was lower than normal. And so far this year, my spending is especially low. Despite its imperfections, the 4% rule is still widely used. It's handy, and we don't have anything better. If you'd like to learn more about this subject, visit earlyretirementnow.com for an exhaustive discussion of sustainable withdrawal rates and the 4% rule. Now that we've reached the end of this lesson, let's put everything together. The amount you need saved for retirement is a function of how long you expect to live and how much you intend to spend. Most people can sustainably spend about 4% of their wealth snowball each year during retirement. Here's how this works in practice. First, let's assume that you followed the recommendations in previous lessons. You're earning more and you're spending less. You're investing your profits wisely, with somewhere between 50% and 75% allocated to stock index funds and most of the rest in bond funds. Now, calculate how much you're likely to spend in retirement. Use your current annual spending as a starting point, then make adjustments based on what you know of your personal situation and goals. Now, let's pick a projected withdrawal rate. If you believe you'll live for about 30 years in retirement, assume a 4% withdrawal rate in your calculations. If you believe you'll have a longer retirement, either because you'll retire young or because you'll have a long life or both, then assume a 3% withdrawal rate. And if you think your retirement horizon will only be 10 or 20 years, it's okay to assume a 5% withdrawal rate. With this info, you can determine how much you'll want to save. To do this, divide your projected annual spending by your selected withdrawal rate. Let's go back to the example I used earlier in this lesson. $50,000 in yearly spending with a 30-year retirement horizon. With 30 years left, we'll assume a 4% withdrawal rate. Dividing 50,000 by 0.04, we find that you'd want a nest egg of $1.25 million before retiring. That's much less than the $1.5 million we calculated earlier using simple arithmetic. Before we wrap things up, I'd like to point out that there's an easier way to do this math. You don't need to divide by fractions. If you're targeting a 4% initial withdrawal rate, you can multiply your projected spending by 25 to find how much you'll want to save for retirement. If you're targeting a 3% withdrawal rate, multiply your spending by 33. And if you're targeting a 5% withdrawal rate, multiply your spending by 20. Whichever withdrawal rate you choose, you'll make adjustments each year to compensate for inflation. And what about when times get tough? What if the economy takes a sudden nosedive? In our next lesson, we'll answer that question as we explore common challenges and setbacks in early retirement.